Picture this. You're scrolling through social media and there you see it. Your high school classmate's shiny new car. Your coworker posted about their recent promotion. Or you see nice pics of your friend's new house. You feel that pit in your stomach. You feel behind. Now, if you feel financially behind, then you are not alone. This is a universal feeling that the majority of people go through. 89% of Americans said they haven't reached their version of financial success, and 27% believe they never will. It's a lot of people. So my goal is to help you feel better about this whole situation, to feel less behind. And I'll attempt to do that by breaking down this phrase word by word. What does it even mean to feel financially behind? Let's take the operative word behind. Being behind can only happen in a state of self-comparison. One, either you feel behind relative to your peers because, let's face it, we tend to compare ourselves against those closest to us, like our friends and family. Or two, you feel behind based on expectations you have of yourself. And this is typically shaped by the culture and society around us. Now, I'd like to walk you through each type of social comparison. Feeling financially behind your peers. Now, I felt financially behind from a very young age. My mom was a single mom, and we never felt poor or that we didn't have enough food on the table, but I survived off of school lunch vouchers, whereas a lot of my classmates didn't. So even from that young age, I was highly aware, even though I didn't know that socioeconomic label at the time, that I was lower middle class. But living in a good school district, I was astonished when I first went to some of my classmates' homes to do class projects. Some of them lived not just in big houses, but they lived in estates. For many of them, their first cars as a 17-year-old was a BMW or Mercedes-Benz. Meanwhile, my family was fine, but I always had this reference point, this social comparison point in which I felt many things about being behind. There's a psychologist named Festinger who has this famous social comparison theory that he developed in the 1950s. And I find that to be pretty informative here. Generally, we're unable to judge ourselves accurately, so it's easier to compare ourselves to other people to form an evaluation. Makes sense? And actually, our brains work in quite a logical way. We compare most with people in our proximity to form this reference group for us. They're the ones next to us or the most similar to us, and we look to that for a more immediate action or inspiration. That just naturally makes sense. And that's why we tend to compare more amongst our peers rather than to celebrities or billionaires. That still happens today, and social media definitely exacerbates that with influencer culture, but more or less, we still care mostly about the opinions of those around us, and that's why the phrase keeping up with the Joneses exists. The Joneses more or less represent that proximal neighbor, that neighbor across the street who you could visually see what's going on when they have a new car or a new roof. Now, as I grew up and met more people and got more into this financial education work, I realized that my childhood comparisons of wealth were completely off base and incomplete. I met six-figure earners who were up to their eyeballs in debt, or couples who had to sell their home because they couldn't afford their mortgage anymore. So my mental model really became such that wealth is really invisible, and it helped me to think of wealth as an iceberg. The tip of that wealth iceberg that you see is simply just other people's spending. Fancy cars, designer bags, tropical vacations. What we don't see below the surface represents the actual wealth that someone has. Someone has a flashy car, but they might be behind on their car payments. Someone looks frugal on the outside, but they have a deep sense of financial peace. While social media can exacerbate unrealistic perceptions of wealth, think of wealth as something that you don't see, and what you see externally may not be the true picture. That should soften the judgment and help create some distance with that self-comparison mode of being, which is pretty miserable. Now let's explore the other angle, feeling financially behind based on societal standards. Now think back to the rules you might have learned growing up. Graduate by 22, land a job by 25, get married or buy a house by 30. Welcome to the social clock. In the 1960s, there was this psychologist named Bernice Newgarden who coined the term social clock to explain why there are these cultural expectations of when things should happen in life. So if you're off the clock, like if you get married quite late or you don't have a house yet and all your friends do, then you feel behind relative to that social clock. But the fact is that things change and the clock can be quite behind. The current economic climate today is a completely different reality compared to, let's say, the 1980s. In 1980, a home costs about 3 times the annual income, but now that same home costs 7 times. So there's a disconnect when today's youth expect to do just as well as prior generations, while given a different set of variables in a different economic reality. And studies show that trying to conform to these broad societal expectations only increases stress and decreases life satisfaction. Now, one antidote is to recognize that the world will keep changing and that the social clock may actually be what's behind, not us. When your goals are extrinsic, like I must have X by Y because society says so, you're chasing society's script, and that script may be outdated, and you're not chasing your own goals anchored to your values. We could also look to self-determination theory for inspiration. This theory basically says that pursuing goals based on internal values like autonomy, purpose, leads to increased well-being and motivation that lasts a lot longer than having these arbitrary external benchmarks, like when you should get married or buy a house. So how do we reclaim authentic goals? Some questions that might help. Why do I want this? Is it because it truly aligns with my values or because it looks good on paper or on social media? Who set this expectation? Is it my parents, my grandparents, my community or neighbors and friends? What would life look like if I designed it around what energizes and fulfills me rather than around checkpoints that no longer fit the modern world? Now, I want to come back to the phrase, I feel behind financially. And I'm staring at that primary verb, feel. Okay, feelings are valid. You could feel behind, but do you know that you are behind? What about basing your comparison on more objective forms of data? Ironically, I'm going to suggest a form of comparison, and that is using financial statistics and measures. If you look at the financial picture of the average American, you'll find that 61% live paycheck to paycheck. The average American makes $70K a year, and most save only about 4.5% of their income. And I hope that's a good kind of reality check, because this suggests that maybe we've just been exposed to a little bit too much of perfection, distorting our reality. Based on some of these numbers, if you start by saving 5%, then you're already above average. And then you increase it to 10%, you're saving twice the average rate, and on and on. So it's not too hard to become above average. The point that I'm making is twofold. The first is that we're going to compare anyway, so why not compare using some real data, introduce some quantitative data rather than just qualitative data. Qualitative data, like looking at your neighbor's new car, is not enough. The second point is that you get to choose who and what you compare yourself to. I personally find it more useful to recognize that we're all going to compare, so you might as well compare up for inspiration or compare down for gratitude. What I mean by that is you could compare up to see people who inspire you, who hold the values that you want to go towards. Maybe it's an athlete who lives their life a certain way, or an entrepreneur, and you use them as a reference point, as a way to be inspired and create some more internal energy to march along the path that you want to walk. If you compare down, I know it sounds bad, but there are so many people who are in a worse station of life than you are. There's always people doing better or worse than us, right? So when you compare down in that way, it gives rise to gratitude. Perhaps spending time in some communities or volunteer opportunities where you are helping other people can help increase that sense of gratitude. If you stay stuck in the middle, which is that pure comparison level, just seeing like who has what nicer car and promotion and who's making a little bit more money, that's going to make you miserable. So don't stay stuck in the middle of comparison. Now let's come back to finances. What do we do about our money? Even if my words have helped you feel less behind financially, you might still feel stuck. The trick is, like anything else, to start small and to generate momentum in an area of your finances and then just build from one block to the other. My favorite tactic is to focus on building a financial buffer and keep expanding that, starting from 1 month of expenses. For example, take a quick exercise to evaluate how much you spend in a month and use that as your baseline because it's very tangible, right? You could think of it as, hey, every time I save up 1 month of expenses, I've also saved a future month for myself. And then it's up to you on how to grow that buffer. Maybe you want 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, a year. It at least helps you start by focusing what's in front of you and what action you can take. Then after building a sufficient financial buffer, move on to higher leverage forms of money like investing. I'm passionate about teaching people how to do investing themselves, what I call DIY investing. Because there is one societal metric that I think is completely bullshit, and that is retiring by 65. Now, that is a completely arbitrary number, and that should not dictate how long you work. Instead, most people, if they were exposed to investing in financial education early, they could actually retire in their 40s and 50s, at least a decade before the traditional retirement age. Unfortunately, more than half of people don't feel like they're contributing enough to retirement. So if you plant your seeds early enough, you shouldn't have to wait that long to retire and build up that financial cushion. That's why the earlier that you invest, the better. I just don't see any downsides to having that early investment mentality. And I hope you take a look at the work that I do in that area. Hopefully it inspires you to start investing if you haven't already. Now I'm going to end this by talking about the other side of feeling behind financially. Maybe there's a good side to it. Now I'm going to tell you a story. When I was in middle school, our music director, her name's Miss Ragusa. I don't know how this conversation came up in orchestra class, but someone was telling Miss Ragusa that they were worried about not getting good enough at the violin. By the way, I played the cello. And her response to that student always stuck with me. She said, if you worry, then that means you care. And if you really care, then you'll get better. What a reframe, huh? If you worry about your finances, that means you care about your financial life. And there's an opportunity to translate that worry into care, into action. And that is much better than the alternative, which is financial disengagement. Just throwing your hands up, burying your head in the sand, ignoring your finances, and giving up. That is much worse of an outcome than feeling that you're behind. So yeah, you might feel financially behind. That's okay. So do the majority of people actually. But that feeling might be the catalyst for making real changes to your life that improves your finances, improves your relationship to money, and not someone else's reality. I'm Oz Chen, and I help you mind your money.